Right now, in the summer of 2026, the third best-selling car in Britain isn't a Ford, it isn't a Volkswagen, it isn't even a Nissan Qashqai, the crossover that's practically wallpaper on every motorway in the country. It's a JAC 7. Go on, say it out loud. JAC. If you've never heard that name before, you're not alone. Most of Britain hadn't either, not 18 months ago. And yet there it sits, ahead of the Golf, ahead of the Qashqai, outsold only by the Ford Puma and the Kia Sportage. That's not a blip. That's not a rounding error in the SMMT registration tables. That's a red warning light on the dashboard of British motoring, and it's been flashing for a while now. Here's the number that should really stop you mid-sip of your tea. Chinese badged cars now account for roughly 15% of every new car registered in this country. 15%. A year earlier it was closer to 7%. That's 121% growth in 12 months, at a time when the rest of the market is basically standing still. Add up MG, BYD, and the Chery stable of JAC and Omoda, and you get a combined market share bigger than Toyota and Nissan put together. Two brands that for decades were the safe, sensible, you can't go wrong choice on any British driveway. They're being outsold. Not by upstarts nobody's ever heard of, exactly, but by a wave of manufacturers most of us couldn't have named this time 2 years ago. So how did we get here? How does a country that once built more cars per capita than almost anywhere on Earth end up watching Chinese brands eat its home market alive? The answer isn't one single thing. It's a chain of decisions, closures, and cold financial logic stretching back 20 years, and it starts, funnily enough, with a British badge that never actually left. Let's talk about MG, because MG is the whole story in miniature. Once upon a time, MG was as British as a rainy bank holiday. Built in Abingdon, then later at Longbridge, in Birmingham, the beating heart of the Midlands car industry. Then, in April 2005, MG Rover collapsed. The administrators walked in, 6,000 jobs went with them almost overnight, and by July that year the wreckage of the company had been sold off to Nanjing Automobile Corporation, China's oldest car maker. A couple of years later, in December 2007, the much larger SAIC motor absorbed Nanjing whole, and with it, the MG badge. For a while there was still a flicker of British production. Longbridge kept assembling the MG3 Super Mini from parts shipped over in kit form from China. But on a Tuesday in July 2016, the last MG rolled off that Longbridge line, a black MG3, wrapped in a Union flag for the cameras, and that was that. SAIC said centralizing production in China would create a leaner business model. Reading between the lines, Brexit uncertainty made the decision easy. Why keep investing in a UK plant when nobody could say for certain what trading with Europe was going to look like in 5 years? Even after that last MG3 rolled off the Longbridge line, SAIC didn't walk away from the site entirely. It kept the SAIC Motor Technical Centre there running, retaining more than 300 design engineers and support staff, with new apprentices still being taken on in the years since. So the badge, the design brainpower, and a working slice of British engineering jobs all survived, even as the assembly line itself fell silent. So MG became, in practical terms, a Chinese car sold under a British nameplate. And here's the twist nobody saw coming. It worked, spectacularly. 7 years ago, MG was shifting under 10,000 cars a year in this country, a rounding error, a curiosity for people who liked the badge and didn't ask too many questions. Now it's pushing close to 90,000 a year. The MG HS alone sat at number 8 in the UK's best-selling car list in the first half of 2026, outselling the Mini Cooper. MG has now delivered over 1 million cars across Europe, with Britain as its single biggest market, and more than 300,000 of those have been fully electric. A brand that Britain effectively let die in 2005 came back from China and became one of the best-selling names on British roads. Let that sink in for a second. Now bring BYD into it, because BYD's story is even faster. In 2024, BYD sold about 9,000 cars in the UK. In 2025, that number jumped to 40,000. By the first third of 2026, it had become the UK's best-selling electric car brand outright, with over 12,700 registrations and more than 7% of the market, enough to leapfrog Tesla, Kia, BMW and Volkswagen. And it did that without even qualifying for the government's electric car grant, the scheme designed to nudge buyers toward cheaper EVs. BYD didn't need the leg up, it just undercut everyone anyway. Omoda tells a similar growth story, and it's worth pausing on it, because Omoda and JAC actually share a parent company, Chery, and often a showroom floor at the same dealership. The Omoda 5 landed in Britain in the second half of 2024, with barely a handful of dealers signed up to sell it. By the summer of 2025, that number had grown to around 80 franchise dealers across the UK. For a brand nobody outside the trade press had heard of a year earlier, that's an extraordinary pace of expansion. Chery clearly isn't treating any of this as a toe in the water. It's building the same kind of bricks and mortar footprint that took Kia and Hyundai the better part of 2 decades to establish when they first arrived from South Korea in the 1990s, fighting the exact same reputation problem and eventually winning it comprehensively. Omoda backs the 5 with the same 7-year, 100,000-mile warranty logic as its stablemates, and that warranty does double duty. It reassures a nervous first buyer standing on the forecourt, and it protects resale value further down the line, since a warranty that transfers to the next owner is worth real money on the used car market. Which brings us to the actual mechanics of why this is happening, because it isn't magic and it isn't charity. It's price, and it's policy, in roughly equal measure. Chinese-built cars are landing in UK showrooms somewhere between £3,000 and £8,000 cheaper than the closest European equivalent, model for model, spec for spec. Some of that gap is genuine manufacturing efficiency, enormous battery and component supply chains, vertically integrated in a way most Western manufacturers can only dream of. BYD, for instance, makes its own batteries in-house, which is a huge chunk of the cost of any EV sorted out before the car even reaches a dealership. But there's a second reason, and it's a very British one: tariffs, or rather, the lack of them. Back in 2024, the European Union slapped tariffs of up to 35% on top of the existing 10% duty on Chinese-built electric vehicles, specifically to protect its own EV manufacturing base, factories in Germany, France and elsewhere, that Brussels was determined to shield. The UK did nothing of the sort: no extra tariff, no protective wall. And the blunt reason is that Britain, post-Brexit, simply doesn't have much of a domestic EV manufacturing industry left to protect. You can't erect trade barriers to save factories that have already shut down. So while a Chinese-built EV arriving in Hamburg gets hit with a tariff bill that can add thousands of euros to the sticker price, the same car rolling off the same ship in Southampton or Tilbury sails through largely unhindered. It's one of the strange, unplanned side effects of Brexit: cheaper Chinese electric cars for British buyers than for their neighbours across the Channel. Put actual numbers next to that, and it stops being abstract. The BYD Dolphin, a small electric hatchback that competes directly with cars like the Renault Zoe and the entry-level Vauxhall Corsa Electric, starts at under £22,000 and still manages over 260 miles of range on a charge. Step up to the BYD Seal, a proper mid-size electric saloon, and the pricing gets genuinely uncomfortable for the established players. It lands close enough to a Tesla Model 3 that cross-shopping the two has become completely normal on comparison sites, something that would have sounded absurd 5 years ago when Chinese saloon and Tesla rival were not phrases anyone put in the same sentence. That's the real shift. This isn't budget brand positioning anymore, cheap and cheerful and a bit embarrassing to admit you drive. It's mid-market and, in places, genuinely premium, wearing a price tag that undercuts the competition anyway. Then there's the warranty question, because this is where Chinese brands have quietly outmaneuvered the old guard on their own turf. BYD offers 7 years or 100,000 miles on the vehicle, and 8 years or 125,000 miles on the battery pack specifically. Numbers that make Volkswagen Group, Stellantis, Ford, Renault, BMW and Mercedes-Benz look almost stingy with their standard 3 to 5 year cover. For a nervous first-time EV buyer standing on a forecourt, unsure whether a battery pack is going to need replacing in year 6, that kind of warranty isn't a marketing gimmick, it's the entire sale. Now, it isn't all one-way traffic, and it wouldn't be honest to pretend otherwise. Insurance is the sticking point that keeps coming up in conversation after conversation with owners and brokers alike. Chinese cars are, for now, noticeably more expensive and more awkward to insure than an equivalent Volkswagen or Toyota, purely because insurers don't yet have years of claims data, crash repair costs, or parts availability history to work from. A JQ7 might be cheaper to buy than a Qashqai, but the first insurance quote can wipe out a fair chunk of that saving, at least until the actuaries catch up. It's the sort of thing that never shows up in a glossy brochure, and it's exactly the kind of detail owners warn each other about once the bad shock has worn off. And that bad shock is real, by the way. Ask anyone who's cross-shopped one of these against something familiar. The recurring story, told slightly differently by different people but always landing in the same place, goes something like this. Someone walks onto a forecourt, dead set on a Qashqai or a Sportage, because that's what everyone they know drives. That's the safe, boring, sensible choice. Then they sit in a JQ7 or an MG HS, notice the leather that shouldn't be there at that price point, the 7-year warranty paperwork on the desk, and a bill that's several £1,000s lower than the badge they walked in expecting to buy. Half of them leave in the Chinese car anyway, slightly sheepish about it, occasionally fielding a raised eyebrow from a father-in-law who still remembers when made in China meant something disposable. The other half walk away, not because the car was bad, but because the badge on the bonnet mattered more to them than the numbers on the page. Both reactions tell you the same thing. The product argument has basically already been won. What's left is a generational trust problem, and that erodes slower than a spec sheet. And that question of long-term value is exactly where this story gets less tidy, because not every Chinese brand landing on these shores is winning. Take GWM Aura, a completely separate operation from Chery and SAIC, best known here for the Aura 03 hatchback. It arrived with genuine ambition and a genuinely striking design, but the numbers tell a brutal story. The Aura 03 has been clocked as the fastest depreciating car sold in Britain, worth barely a quarter of its original price after just 3 years on the road, a collapse in value that makes even the leakiest diesel SUV of the 2010 S look like a rock-solid investment by comparison. Registrations fell off a cliff too. Just 26 Aura 03s were registered in the first 3 months of 2026, on the back of a little over 500 for the whole of the previous year. By spring, GWM's UK importer had quietly stopped taking new factory orders altogether, meaning once the existing dealer stock runs dry, that's it, no new Aura 03s left to buy in Britain. It's the clearest reminder yet that Chinese car brand isn't one single story with one single outcome. A 7-year warranty and an aggressive price only carry a brand so far if the wider public never quite builds trust in what happens to that car's value 5 years down the line. For every MG or BYD quietly climbing the sales charts, there's an Aura sitting in the background as a warning about exactly how fast this can go the other way. Meanwhile, the industry these cars are muscling into is one that's been quietly bleeding out for years, largely without the same headlines. Honda shut its Swindon plant in 2021 after 36 years, taking 3,500 jobs with it. Ford closed its Bridgend engine factory in 2020. And in March of this year, Vauxhall's Luton plant, a site that had been building vehicles since 1905, 120 years of unbroken history, closed for good. UK vehicle production in the first half of 2025 fell to just 417,000 cars and vans, the lowest figure for that period since 1953. 1953. That's not a modern low, that's a low that predates most of the motorway network this country now drives on. Full-year output is expected to land under COVID-era levels, which is a genuinely staggering thing to type out loud about an industry that once defined entire towns. So when people say Chinese brands are taking over, what's actually happening is subtler and, in a way, sadder. They're not so much conquering a thriving industry as filling a vacuum that British and long-established European manufacturing left behind when the sums stopped adding up. Nobody forced Honda out of Swindon. Nobody forced Vauxhall out of Luton after 120 years. Those were business decisions, made in boardrooms in Tokyo and Detroit and Frankfurt, about where it was cheapest to build the next generation of cars. China said yes to that question when everyone else was hesitating, and Britain, tariff-free, hungry for affordable EVs, largely indifferent by that point to where the badge on the bonnet actually came from, said yes right back. And this isn't some fringe experiment that might quietly fizzle out. When UK dealers were asked which of the newer Chinese entrants they expect to actually succeed here long-term, XPeng topped the poll, followed closely by Omoda, then BYD, then Lynk & Co and NIO. These brands aren't treating Britain as a one-season stunt. They're opening proper dealer networks, building parts distribution hubs on British soil, working with Thatcham, the industry body that rates security and repairability, and training up British technicians to actually service these things when they go wrong. That's not the behavior of a brand planning to grab some quick sales and vanish. That's the behavior of a brand planning to still be here in 2036. Which brings us back to that JQ7 sitting there at number 3 on the bestseller list, quietly outselling cars with badges that have been trusted on British roads for generations. It's tempting to feel a bit uneasy about that, and plenty of people do. There's something that stings about watching the market Britain used to build get filled, model by manufacturers who didn't exist here a decade ago, while the factories that used to do that job sit empty in Luton and Swindon and Bridgend. But it's worth being honest about the other side of that coin too. For actual buyers, this has meant cheaper electric cars, longer warranties, and more choice than this country has seen on forecourts in a very long time. The nostalgia for badges built on home soil is real, and it's earned. It just isn't what most people are weighing up when they're stood in a dealership trying to work out what they can actually afford to drive their kids to school in next year. Think about what that actually means for a moment. A car with a Union flag stitched into its marketing, sold from showrooms with English high street addresses, serviced by British-trained technicians, engineered in part by British engineers, still clocking in at Longbridge every morning. built, ultimately in China, for a country that no longer builds enough cars of its own to have much say in the matter anymore. That's not a headline anyone in the industry particularly wanted to write. It's simply the one the sales figures keep confirming, month after month, chart after chart. So here's the real question worth sitting with, and it isn't really about MG or BYD or JAC at all. It's about what British car even means anymore, when the most British name in this entire story, MG, Abingdon, Longbridge, 100 years of history, is now, in every meaningful sense, a Chinese car wearing a British badge that Britain itself let go bankrupt. Was that a betrayal, or was it just the market doing exactly what markets do, finding the cheapest hands willing to keep the lights on? Whatever your answer, the numbers on the SMMT charts don't care about sentiment, and next year's list is very likely to have even more unfamiliar names climbing even higher up it. If you've driven one of these, an MG, a BYD, a JAC, and a Moda, drop a comment and tell us honestly what changed your mind, or what didn't. And if you're the sort who still can't get past the badge, that's worth saying too, because that reaction is exactly what's being tested here, one forecourt at a time. Either way, stick around, because this shift in the British car market is only just getting started, and there's a lot more of this story still to come.